Now it's time to hear your voice.
Campaigning is heating up in Canada after Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called for a snap election. Opinion polls show his Liberal Party losing ground to the main opposition Conservative Party led by Erin O'Toole. Hello and welcome to Daily Mirror World Focus. I'm Iswaran Ratnam. As Canadians prepare to go to the polls in September, polls watchers have indicated that Prime Minister Trudeau may regret his decision to call for a snap election. Joining us from Canada to discuss how campaigning has gone so far is Nick Nanos, Chief Data Scientist of Nanos Research, and Sean Simpson, Vice President of Ipsos Public Affairs Canada. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Nick, I'd like to start with you. What made Trudeau go for a snap election?
Well, Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government is a minority government, which means they do not have a majority at this particular point in time. The other thing is that the timing seemed good for the federal Liberal Party in Canada, that they'd come off a very successful vaccination campaign where Canada now has among the highest levels of vaccinations in the world, that it had been pumping stimulus spending to help Canadians pay their bills through the pandemic and also to help Canadian businesses cover their expenses. And I would expect that the Liberals thought that there was a bit of a sweet spot to call an election while there was still a bit of a vaccination halo before the stimulus checks stopped going out, before jobs might be lost as a result of the pandemic, and before we got into a, heaven forbid, fourth wave in the fall. So I think the Liberals thought they had a sweet spot where they could win a smash and grab majority.
And how has the performance of Trudeau's Liberal Party-led government been in the recent past?
Yeah, well, 4 weeks ago, actually, in the Nanos tracking that we did, the Liberals had a double-digit lead in the polls, and they were in majority territory. But what we saw is in the week before the campaign, that double-digit lead went to a single-digit lead, and now there's a tight race between the Liberals and the Conservatives because the Conservatives have been gaining some steam. The good news for the Liberals is that although from a popular point perspective, it's close between the Liberals and the Conservatives, the Liberal support converts into more seats in the House of Commons, probably 40 to 50 more seats than the Conservatives. And I think this is probably what the Liberals are hoping for. This has to do with the fact that there are parts of the country where the Conservatives are so strong, it's like wasted votes. You know, you win a particular electoral district by 20, 30%, while the Liberals win a whole bunch of ridings by like 2 and 3% across the country. So for the Liberals, what looks like a tie in the national support is actually an advantage, probably a 40-seat advantage when it comes to seats in the House of Commons.
Of course, your most recent data shows the popularity of Trudeau dropping and Erin O'Toole rising. What would you attribute that to?
Well, first of all, at the beginning of the campaign, I'll say grumpiness among voters about the election being called, right? We're just getting over the third wave in Canada. Canadians are just getting ready to go for their kids to go back to school. They're having vacation, seeing their family and friends for the first time in 18 months. So what I'll say, a bit of grumpiness related to that. And the other thing is one of the reasons why the Conservatives have been able to narrow the gap has been the brand of their leader has actually improved noticeably in the first 5 or 6 days of the campaign. And he hasn't picked up what I'll say support at the expense of the Liberals. It's been undecided voters who have looked at Erin O'Toole, who's the leader of the Conservative Party, and decided to opt for him. The big question is, will the trend continue? And how effective will the campaigns be in the coming weeks?
What are the main candidates actually offering the public at this election?
Well, more recently, there's been a debate about public health care. We have universal access to public health care in Canada, and the Liberals have attacked Erin O'Toole, the Conservative Party leader, on comments that he made about the role of a potential role of the private sector in our Canadian public health care system. And so healthcare is a big issue. Another issue is home affordability. Real estate prices have been going up. People are struggling to pay their rent and also pay their mortgage. In a recent survey that we did, it estimated that there are about 4.9 million Canadians who are unsure or worried about whether they'll be able to pay the rent or pay their mortgage in the next 30 days. So all of the parties have been focusing on housing affordability because that affects people that rent and people that own their home. And then there's been the pandemic and vaccinations, and the Liberals have tried to use that to attack the Conservatives. The Liberals are in favor of mandatory vaccinations, for example, for all workers in the Canadian federal government, while Aaron O'Toole is not in favor of forcing people, but wants to educate people to vaccinate them. So that's been another big issue in the campaign.
Sean, are we seeing a situation now where by calling for a snap election, Trudeau has allowed the Conservatives to come out and show what they can do for the country?
Absolutely. The last year and a half, of course, Canadians have been fixed on their leaders and have really rallied around their leaders in their response to the pandemic. In fact, the Prime Minister's approval rating was in the 50s, close to 60% at some points throughout the campaign. Meanwhile, Aaron O'Toole, the leader of the Conservative Party, was struggling to get any airtime at all. Nobody was really focused on him or the other opposition parties. The campaign automatically gives him now a greater spotlight as Canadians test him out, kick the tires to learn more about who Aaron O'Toole is, and Jagmeet Singh for that matter as well. Now that Canadians are becoming a little bit more familiar with Mr. O'Toole, some seem to like what they're seeing. And if they were upset with the Prime Minister for calling an election, they're now looking at some of the other alternatives. And so far, Aaron O'Toole has been able to increase the value of his stock, and particularly in Quebec, he was really able to seize the agenda the first week and introduce himself to Quebecers in a way that he just hasn't been able to do over the last 18 months.
How has the Canadian government managed the coronavirus pandemic? I mean, have Canadians been satisfied with how the situation was dealt with?
Well, the public has been largely satisfied. Now, back in the late 2020, Canadians came to the realization that we actually don't produce COVID-19 vaccines here in Canada. And what that meant is that we were going to be behind the United States, behind the United Kingdom, behind many other countries, Israel, of course, in the acquisition and rollout of the vaccine. So the winter were dark months in Canada as we watched vaccination rates climb in other parts of the world while we were still waiting to receive our vaccines. Once we started getting millions and millions of vaccines almost every week come the springtime, the rollout of the vaccination program went very well. And then we surpassed the United States. And of course, that we like to compare ourselves to the United States all of the time. And we saw that the approval ratings for the Prime Minister jumped as a result. So strong vaccines, we've more or less had have a COVID-19 case count under control over the course of the summer. The Canadians were largely approval of the Prime Minister. Now, of course, the Delta variant is wreaking havoc around the world. Here in Canada as well, case counts are climbing. We're in a fourth wave of the pandemic. And the Prime Minister's fortunes seem to rise and fall with case counts and the vaccination effort, which is stalled a little bit as some people are holding out and not so sure whether or not they want to get the vaccine. So all of this, I would say, is now a challenge for the Prime Minister because he can't simply campaign on his laurels. The vaccine is not, sorry, the COVID-19 has not been beat. We're still trying to vaccinate Canadians. Restrictions are coming back in place. And we could find ourselves by September 20th in a situation where we're placing greater restrictions once again on Canadians. Now, these are driven by the provinces, of course, but there's one person, who's kind of got overall influence, and that's the Prime Minister. And Canadians, again, will come back to why we called an election during this risky time in Canada, and they may punish the Prime Minister as a result.
Despite the pandemic, we see the candidates engaged in house-to-house campaigning. Isn't that a big risk?
It could be, but I mean that's the traditional way of campaigning in Canada, and I'm sure that the door knockers, once they knock on the door, stepping back and wearing their masks and doing all of the things that Canadians expect of them. So I think it might actually be seen as an even more sincere gesture to knock on someone's door than it has been in the past, given some of the difficulties involved with it. But very much a traditional way of local candidates meeting the constituents, and something that I think Canadians still value very much.
We also see the NDP gaining public support over the past few days. Nick, talk to us about the NDP and the other smaller parties contesting this election.
Yeah, so the New Democrats are led by Jagmeet Singh. They're at around 17%. They're in third place, noticeably behind the two front-running leaders. Jagmeet Singh's personal brand is actually as strong as Justin Trudeau's. He's very likable. People like what he stands for. He's very good on the campaign trail, but he has not been able to garner that same type of excitement that other New Democratic leaders in Canada have had and been able to mobilize in the past. But there's significant upside for Jagmeet Singh just because of his likability and his good performance on the campaign trail. And then there's Annamie Paul, the new leader of the Green Party of Canada. About 20 to 25% of Canadians are open to voting and would consider voting for the Green Party of Canada. But the Green Party of Canada has been having internal bickering, so to speak, on a number of issues. And there's no funds that have been made available for their national party leader to run a national campaign. So it might be odd to say, but the Green Party leader of Canada is spending most of her time in her riding, trying to win her riding, as opposed to being out crisscrossing the country, trying to persuade voters. And then finally, there's Blanchette, who's the leader of the separatist Bloc Québécois. He's just running in the province of Quebec, which is Canada's francophone province. And he's got the easiest job among all the federal party leaders. No one will ever expect him to win, and he doesn't have a platform. That's all he says is, vote for the Bloc Québécois, and we will try to get as much out of the Federation and the federal government as possible. And it's an easy parking space for a lot of voters in Quebec.
Sean, who is Jagmeet Singh? Why do you think he is gaining popularity when realistically he does not stand a chance of winning this election?
I think it's a fresh face. I think he has an optimism, a youthful vigor, a personality that many like and respect. He also looks more like the new Canada. His family is obviously from a different background from Erin O'Toole and the Prime Minister. He's got those sort of immigrant family credentials that resonate with a lot of people in this country. In Toronto proper, half of the people who live in Toronto were not born in Canada, and so they see a little bit of themselves in Jagmeet Singh and his family as well. So I think it's just a youthful, new way of looking at things. He has some fresh ideas, some fresh perspectives. He's articulate. He performs well in debates. Some of his policies are new and push the envelope a little bit. And I think Canadians at this particular juncture, where we're talking about the path forward in a post-pandemic world, are open to exploring some new possibilities, like different policies for housing, like universal basic incomes, for example, which the NDP are proposing.
Will the NDP and other parties spoil votes as opposed to make any real impact at this election?
Certainly. I mean, the Bloc Québécois do not run seats outside of Quebec, so they have no chance of forming a national government. The Green Party seems to be in disarray, and in fact is polling at about 5%, which is about half of the popular vote, where they would normally be, or would want to be anyway. So that leaves the NDP, which is the wild card. Now, the NDP at the moment is polling at 21% of the vote. Jagmeet Singh is likable. People really like him. It's now his second election cycle, so he's reasonably well known to the Canadian population. That said, the NDP has never formed government on a national basis in Canada, and really never even come close to it. So they are the third party. Their role in this election is likely as spoiler. Now, they don't really have an impact on the Conservative Party and the amount of votes that they have, but they have an absolute profound impact on the number of votes that the Liberal Party get, as the more progressive voters tend to oscillate between the NDP and the Liberals. So if the NDP polls where they are now, or even a few points better, up to 23, 25% of the popular vote, those votes are coming at the expense of Liberal Party. And what that does is it gives the Conservatives an even stronger chance at securing more seats as the progressive vote is split. So the NDP, a strong NDP, is to the benefit of the Conservative Party, and the Liberals know that, which is why they spend a lot of time attacking Jagmeet Singh and the NDP to try to shore up their base to make sure they don't lose any votes to the left.
Nick, we know Canada is home to a huge diaspora community from Sri Lanka, India, and other Asian countries. How significant will the vote of the diaspora be at this election?
Oh, that's very significant. And the diaspora punches above its weight politically because it tends to be concentrated. It's not spread out. So there are, the diaspora also happens to align with a lot of the key battleground areas outside of the Toronto area, for example, in the Greater Toronto area, in the Vancouver and the Lower Mainland in British Columbia. And those are key battlegrounds that will decide the outcome of the election. And all of the parties are competing for voters in those key, like the Mississauga, Bramptons, outside of Toronto, and then outside of outside of Vancouver, British Columbia. So, the interesting thing is that, for many of those voters, they're actually also interested in international politics, not just domestic politics. And it'll be interesting to see, for example, the withdrawal of the mission in Afghanistan has been a big issue in the first week of the campaign. And what's Canada's position going to be on accepting refugees? We know that in the 2015 election, the acceptance of Syrian refugees was welcomed by Canadians and promoted by the Liberals. It gave them the advantage over the Conservatives, whose policy at that time was to think of immigration and refugees as a potential security risk and to protect Canada, while the Liberals were much more generous and focused on the humanitarian situation. So if the Afghanistan issue flares up, it'll not just be an issue for members of the diaspora, it'll be an issue for all Canadians, because one of the things we know from our polling is that there's a consistent and persistent support for accepting refugees in humanitarian crisis. That includes the Syrians. It included the Rohingya, right? And that if Afghanistan kind of flares up, there'll be appetite to welcome Afghan refugees in order to get out of Afghanistan and to be safe.
Does Canada's foreign policy have any impact on how the vote goes?
Well, I don't think it'll be a vote decider, but it could help define the party leaders. And Canada's relations with China have been quite strained in the last number of years because of the arresting of the Huawei executive at the request of the U.S. for an extradition, and also the Chinese government arresting the two Michaels under suspicion of espionage. So relations are very strained between Canada and China right now. But if that is an issue, it's probably more likely to be an issue among what I'll say the Chinese diaspora, which is in northern Toronto and also in Vancouver, where those citizens and voters in those areas that are part of the diaspora from China will be tuned into those issues.
If Trudeau fails to secure a majority at this election, what would it mean for him and his future, not just as prime minister, but as a party leader?
The interesting thing about Justin Trudeau is the brand of the Trudeau family in the Liberal Party of Canada, and that for many voters, especially if you're over 50 or 60 years of age, when they see Justin Trudeau, they think of his father, Pierre Trudeau, who was another long-standing, successful, and very progressive prime minister in Canada who had a very generous immigration and refugee policy also. I would hazard to say that obviously, if Justin Trudeau manages to win a majority, he'll be rock solid. I would say that even if he wins a minority, he will be, I don't think he'll be in any kind of trouble just because the Trudeau brand is part of the Liberal DNA. It would take some type of shocking revelation that would repel people to kind of shake what I'll say the connection that Liberal Party supporters, many Liberal Party supporters have for Justin Trudeau and what I'll say the Trudeau family.
Sean, what would a minority government mean for Canada?
It could mean more of the same. If the Liberals win a plurality of seats, meaning not a majority, but a minority, but the most, then we would probably see things go the way they are, maybe for another 2 years until the Prime Minister calls another election or is defeated in Parliament. But another scenario is very interesting, and that is a scenario where the Conservatives actually win the most seats, but again, not a majority. Now, in Canada, the convention is the prime minister until he is not. And that means that he actually has a right to meet Parliament and to try and govern, even if the Conservatives have more seats. Now, that is his right. But generally speaking, the convention is that the Conservatives would get a chance to form government if they win the most seats. So we might be in a position where there is some jostling for power, some alliances, maybe holy or unholy alliances, depending on who's teaming up with whom, in order to try to cobble together enough votes to win the confidence of Parliament. We also have a new Governor General here in Canada, Mary Simon. Now, her role is largely symbolic, but her perhaps most significant role is in instances where there isn't a clear majority and you've got two sort of willing coalitions who both want to try to meet Parliament and gain the confidence of Parliament, and she's the arbiter of those things. So she may be in for a tough job earlier than maybe she bargained for, but that certainly keeps things interesting in Canada. And Canadians are, I think, becoming a little bit more used to minority governments recently. Historically, we don't get them very often, but in the last, say, 20 years or so, we seem to be having our fair share of them. And I think Canadians like the compromises that come with a minority government. That said, they don't really like elections, and our polling has shown that they want a majority government to happen so that we don't have to do this again for 4 more years.
Is there a likelihood of a coalition being formed to establish a majority government?
We don't often see formal coalitions. What I mean by formal coalitions is, let's say the Liberals continue to govern and they would give cabinet seats to, for example, NDP MPs to sit in cabinet. We don't see that very often in Canada. What would be more likely is that the NDP would support them for a given period of time in Parliament, or maybe even on a case-by-case basis. The Liberals would seek support from the NDP for a particular legislation, maybe from the Bloc for another one. The more difficult coalitions in Canada are on the right. So if the Conservatives have a plurality of seats and are looking to form a partnership with somebody, well, it ain't going to be the Liberals. They're not going to be too entertained by that. The NDP are interesting. They're usually kingmakers in a minority situation, but oftentimes it's very difficult to get the Conservatives and NDP to agree on policies, which leaves the Bloc Québécois. Of course, that's the separatist party within Quebec. Separatism is not a burning issue right now, but it almost seems to me that Erin O'Toole has laid the foundation of these possibilities by spending much of his first opening days of the campaign in Quebec, by outlining his contract with Quebec and saying, here is what I stand for, here is what you can expect from a Conservative government. And he may actually be able to gain the support of some of those Bloc members if he's in a position to wield power in a minority government.
Will the situation in Afghanistan play a role at this election?
Yeah, that's tricky to know and to understand. Although we're going to be polling on that in the coming days and weeks, of course. It's a tricky situation. I mean, Canada hasn't been active in Afghanistan for a number of years, but Canadians I think, vividly remember the contribution that our soldiers made in Afghanistan earlier on in the previous decade. They clearly don't like what's happening there, but what's difficult to know is how much blame is being assigned to Biden, to our own prime minister, or maybe there's no blame going around at all, and it's just a general sense of disappointment. Clearly, the evacuation is not going well, and perhaps the government could be taking additional steps to help evacuate Afghan nationals and those who helped the Canadians when they were more active in the region. The Taliban, of course, is making that very difficult. It seems that the lines of communication between the U.S. and Canada may not be as open as we might have hoped for. So Canada, to a certain extent, is at the whim of the American administration in terms of the evacuation. So my sense is that it is not a huge issue, but if someone is disappointed in the prime minister already for whatever reasons they want to be, Afghanistan is probably one more reason for someone who already didn't like the prime minister to solidify their vote elsewhere.
Well, gentlemen, we will have to leave it at that. Thank you for joining us. And that's all the time we have for you on Daily Mirror World Focus. Till next time, stay safe.